we were sponsored by family. I think my dad's family friend in Seattle to come to the United States. That's when we got our political asylum. So we started off in Seattle. My parents thought it was a cold that they never experienced before. Can you imagine? They're from Vietnam and like the tropical weather, and then suddenly you get dropped off in Seattle and there's things like snow. So my mom said there was like this cold that she could feel in her bones, and they were miserable. And then eventually, it's kind of a cool story. A bunch of Cham people in the refugee camps decided to change their last name to Cham. We all had different last names in the villages of Vietnam. And so my dad and a bunch of his friends that got reunited after the war in the refugee camp said, we're all going to change our last name to Cham because we're going to be dispersed all over the world, and especially in the United States. So they all changed their last name to Cham. So when we were in Seattle, I came when I was 8 months old. And a couple of his friends found him, so they call him up and they said, hey, you got to move down to Orange County. And he goes, why? And they're like, well, have you heard of this thing called the Yellow Book? And my dad's like, what is a Yellow Book? And he goes, well, it's this directory where you can find people by their name. And then his friend says, I found 5 of our family friends, and they're in Fullerton. You got to move down. So my dad packs us in a car from Seattle and drives down, and we settled down in Fullerton. So then I was in Orange County from I think 4 years old till I was about 9. And then when I was 9, we moved up to the Central Valley to Modesto because my uncle came to the United States and he was doing sort of some migrant labor work there. So then we moved to the Central Valley, and then I was there until I came to UCLA for college in 1999. My dad is Cham from Tây Ninh, which is in the south of Vietnam.
What was your family name?
It would be, my dad's first name is Idris, and it's Ghe, G-H-E, and then he changed all of our last name to Cham.
That's kind of cool.
Yeah, and it's cool because I do meet other Cham people, and I'm like, oh, you look Cham, your last name is Cham. Are you Cham? And it's like almost always the case. It's actually a pretty, yeah, if you meet someone with the last name of Cham and they look like me, they're probably Cham.
Well, when you were growing up, how aware of your ethnicity and were you in Vietnam? You were so little then too.
Yeah, I was pretty aware because my dad, even though he was never formally educated, he was really into reading and histories and kind of just understanding the history of our people and just like Southeast Asia in general. So he never had any formal schooling, but he basically reads and writes and speaks like 6 languages. So we just kind of grew up where we learned a lot, and I knew for a very young age that we were part of a special group of people known as the Cham people. So I kind of knew that even at a young age. I didn't know exactly what that meant and all of the history, but we knew like where we came from and that we spoke this language, and we were part of this culture. And Cham people are also Muslim, so to be like Southeast Asian Muslim in the United States, so you kind of knew that like, okay, we're a little bit different, you know?
Mm-hmm. So now when people ask you, how do you describe the history of the Cham people all in like 5 minutes?
Yeah, that's so funny because my good friend Julie and I are always ready for like sort of our elevator pitch because it's such a long history and no one has time to listen to this long history. So I usually say, oh, I'm part of the Cham people, which is where my last name comes from. And I said the Cham people are an indigenous people from what's now modern Central and South Vietnam. And we've been in the region for a long time. And our language is Cham, and we have a long history. There's still about probably over 100,000 Cham people still remaining in Vietnam. The largest Cham population is actually in Cambodia, maybe around close to 300,000 people. So that's the largest territory, and I would say the largest Cham population, according to my research, because there hasn't been a ton of research about Cham people, would be outside of Asia, would be here in the United States.
In reading about Cham history, what sort of things really strike you as being so different about it?
One of the things I learned, and I still try to learn as much as I can, because there's so many, when you're part of a underrepresented Indigenous community where there hasn't been a lot of research or a lot of documentation, or archives have either been lost or throughout war and across borders. One of the things that I think is really neat to learn about is the Cham people established one of the earliest irrigation systems in Southeast Asia. And Cham is actually, the language is Sanskrit based, and I think it's one of the earliest, one of the earlier written languages in Southeast Asia as well. So it's pretty neat to kind of learn about those histories, and of course the architecture. If you go to Vietnam now, some of those temples, I think we talked about Nha Trang, and of course the Cham, they call it the Cham ruins, right, outside of Hoi An, in Mỹ Xuân. That's pretty neat to kind of check out the architecture and how organized, at least during certain times, for the Cham people to kind of build those temples as a monument to the community, but also to honor the rituals of our ancestors. Because the Cham are pretty diverse, so Cham people are either Buddhist, Hindu, or Muslim, or kind of practice a blend of these traditions. And I know the temples were a big part of honoring where our ancestors came from, like in a lot of sort of indigenous and Asian cultures. Unfortunately the Cham people don't currently have real control over those temples because they're a major tourist site in Vietnam. I think the Cham people are able to rent it or borrow it during the sort of for sacred ceremonies, like during the Kate festival, but it doesn't, the control isn't fully remained because of the government.